It's Talk Funny, a podcast by Mark Bailey and other comics from all over. We ended up in Japan because we heard the animals were singing the blues in Japan, not the band The Animals. The actual animals. The Talk Funny podcast from Nagoyaradio.com and Nagoyacomedy. Here's Mark Bailey.
Welcome back to another edition of Talk Funny. I'm Mark Bailey. We're here with Steve Howard. Did you have a good Christmas, Steve?
Yes, I did. It was fantastic.
Christmas in Japan is basically its own podcast because it's across, for those of you that don't live in Japan, it's actually treated by Japanese as Valentine's Day, not the day, Christmas Eve. It's Valentine's Day. Christmas Day is a normal work day, usually. And the decorations and the tree, as a Jew, I'm an expert on this, and they take them down like 6, 7 a.m. in the department stores when you go in on Christmas Day, and there's no sign that there was any Christmas at all, not even a piece of tinsel on the floor. It's like, Jimmy Hoffa style. Just get rid of all the evidence.
I know it's been proven as to be an urban legend, but I always loved the story about when supposedly in the 1950s when they got confused about Santa Claus and Jesus Christ, and they crucified Santa Claus at some big department store for their Christmas sale or something.
I've had Japanese people ask me the significance of Santa Claus and Christmas, and they said, well, to know about that, you really need to know about the religion of Mithraism, and I don't have that handbook on me. Read that book first, and then you'll realize that a lot of the customs, when the Romans took over, they said, these people are going to celebrate either way.
Right.
So we might as well just move. Oh, look, we just finally decided when Jesus was born.
Yep. Saturnalia and Sol Invictus, basically.
Right. So we were going to talk about the difference between, so Steve's from the West Coast. You can say where you're from, and then we'll just go in, since I have nothing else to do, we'll just go in and take that out later.
Okay.
So you're from the West Coast. You want to say what city or what state?
The one famous for coffee.
Okay. I'm an East Coast kind of guy, and I think you may have noticed, but I've noticed a big difference. It's almost a schism, actually, between East Coast comedy and West Coast comedy, and I'm kind of partial to East Coast comedy. I mean, that's just what I'm just used to writing, and it's actually the closest to vaudeville. It's all usually it comes a lot from Jewish and Italian roots, and it's very it's a heavily immigrant entertainment form at the time. And this is a statistic: musicians and comedians that came from Brooklyn, it's probably different now, but up until the 70s, they were like 60 of the U.S. 60% of the hit musicians and 80% of the comics came from the Brooklyn area and sometimes wider New York. But I mean, just from Brooklyn. If you think about like in Nagoya, one of the bar places is in Ikeshita. If you could just picture that almost all the funny Japanese comedians came from this one street in Ikeshita. That's what it's like in Brooklyn. It's called Neptune Avenue in Brooklyn and Coney Island. Joseph Heller was born there. There's a lot of musicians and authors. Steely Dan, both guys from Steely Dan. Carole King, Jerry Goff, and me. I mean, just Seinfeld, a couple of blocks up. It's just amazing because it was a port and heavily immigrant, and so you had to fight like crazy to be witty and be the loudest, be the funniest. And so the East Coast tension is a really big part of comedy. But on the West Coast, beautiful weather. What are you going to complain about, It's a beautiful day again today. Dope. It's like, so I don't get the West Coast humor as much. I mean, I do get humor because humor is a language, and I do understand it. Is it just my imagination, Steve? But it seems to me the East Coast guys are working harder.
Well, I think you mentioned definitely East Coast and New York in particular, New York City in particular. It's all about getting to your point as quickly as possible, and that's very much how.
What is your point? No, I'm kidding.
Whereas on the West Coast, when you're stoned, it's a lot harder to get to your point. So I think maybe that contributes to the differences as well. Yeah,
and it might have something to do also with car culture. Missing Person said it best, nobody walks in L.A. Yeah. So it's a big car culture. Things are kind of further away. In the East Coast, Boston and New York and even Baltimore and a lot of these places, you're walking, you're taking the train, and people are just crushed, more together. So you're more miserable about people. You have more, stories. And so it's tight, and also the weather's horrible. So you've got all those things, and now you've got to be funny. And as opposed to like in California, beautiful weather, beautiful girls, you're driving everywhere, you're really not tensed out, and there may be drugs involved. And I don't know, it just seems to me in the East Coast, the alcohol is the drug of choice, and on the West Coast, people are laid back, and as you said, some of them are stoned. And I don't mind mentioning a couple of these guys. Joe Rogan, I mean, I think all these guys are very talented, but I've noticed since they came to there's some guys who came, like Joe Rogan came from the East Coast to the West Coast, and he's a completely different person. He's a completely different person now. He's mellowed out. He has bad memory. When he has a comic guest on, they both try to not do their bits, and like as opposed to Howard Stern show. If you get Louis C.K. or they had Louis C.K. on Opie and Anthony back when that was a thing. When they had guests on, it was drop dead funny. They had Jim Norton was on regularly. He was drop dead funny all the time because you're still in New York. I mean, you're still on the East Coast and you're still basically auditioning for a job. Yeah.
Well, when Bill Burr's on Rogan's podcast, he's kind of the same way. Always funny.
Yeah. A lot of these guys that I really like, and they're just like even Doug Stanhope. Doug Stanhope is he's from Arizona, but he's got a very East Coast vibe to him. But when he's on Rogan's show, he's a lot more laid back, and so I guess the short version of it is there's no real urgency to be funny because you've made it, man. You're in LA. Why work hard?
And maybe there's some truth to it because I don't think Bill Burr, at least when he's on Rogan's podcast, he's probably not high, but a lot of these other guys you mentioned are probably completely stoned out of their minds, so that might, you're not going to be as quick, obviously, when you're that high, so that might be it too.
And there's another one you can see, these are really great clips on YouTube. Whenever Bill Burr pops in, he used to be a writer for Conan. When he pops in on Conan's show, he's always in a bad mood. It's hilarious to watch. And he's the opposite of improv. Improv is if someone says, I heard you were a fireman. Yes, and his is... no, and it's like I hear you don't really care about the limit. No, I don't, Conan, and this is why. As opposed to Johnny Carson, which was kind of laid back, his humor was milder, and it's hard to do what Johnny Carson did for like 25, 30 years, but it was a little bit more genteel, kind of in the vein of Steve Allen, who was one of my favorites, and he was just kind of mild, and he would put a jibe in, but it wasn't high tension, and you'd catch it later. That was kind of what West Coast used to be. We've gotten so divergent, in my opinion, with the East Coast and the West Coast that when I watch Tom Segura, Bert Kreischer, so I was just wondering if that was just my imagination, or do you see that too?
Yeah, probably not quite as much as you do, because I'm, again, only having done comedy for 3.5 years. I probably don't catch quite as much as you do, but yeah, I think definitely there's some of that for sure.
I mean, you get, for example, these guys I was naming, Tom Segura, Bert Kreischer, they have a little bit of material, and they get up and they tell some stories. They have Netflix specials. I invite you guys to watch those and judge for yourself. And put that up against Anthony Jeselnik or a Bill Burr or a Louis C.K. special from a couple of years ago, back when they were hungry and tense. And it's just no contest, just one-liner. And Jeselnik is one of my favorites because everything he does is just on the edge. Each sentence that he hones is just a missile, and it's not just some story. And, I'm pretty good at telling stories, writing stories, and I can kind of tell when people are making things up, and I'm going to call Bert Kreischer out on this. I think he made up a couple of things about what his daughter said during some of these stories, because just as I'm a language nerd, and he said, well, so my 2-year-old daughter said this. I'm like, I don't think she has that phrasing. She did not say that. And they're dropping F-bombs. And I'm pretty sure your wife's not going to let your 3-year-old do the F-bomb. I'm pretty sure. I don't know how you guys do it on the West Coast, but I'm pretty sure moms all over are like, no, you're not talking like that in my house. So sometimes he'll have a story, and I know he's embellishing some of it. I could just tell by, for example, then I said to my wife, ask the F up. No, you did not say that too well. Years back when, and then that's the end of the story? No, that's not at the end of the story. There's something else. So I can kind of tell when people are embellishing stories, and I think they're doing that on the West Coast. Maybe they're on blood pressure medicine like I am, and they just think it happened. It didn't happen, Before we wrap it up, you've been listening to Talk Funny with Mark Bailey and Steve Howard. Thanks for listening, guys.